It was the sort of night that seems to pause in time, a dusk that never quite becomes darkness, where the sky holds its breath in a fog-laced stillness. In the village of Netherdean, the hedgerows had long since closed their eyes for the evening, and the windows of Ashcombe Hall glowed faintly like oil lamps in a dream. It was Mrs. Withers, the cook, who first raised the alarm, not with a scream, but a quiet, bone-deep certainty as she stood at the threshold of Miss Clara Ashcombe's bedroom the following morning. The door was locked from within, the blinds drawn. No answer to knocking, calling, or even the rapping of Colonel Harcourt's walking stick. The butler, Cray, was sent for a key. When at last the door yielded, it revealed a room untouched by chaos. Clara lay upon the chaise longue near the hearth, a book, the Forsyte Saga, Colonel Harcourt noted aloud, resting unopened in her lap. One stocking slightly rucked, one slipper on. The candle on the bureau, which the maid swore she had snuffed before bed, burned steadily. It was not the sort of tableau that cried out murder. And yet, one felt it, the cold in the room, though the fire had not long died, the unnatural stillness. The smell of lavender and something else beneath it, something sharper, more metallic. Dr. Fernley, a well-fed and often vaguely apologetic man, declared it likely the girl had succumbed to a defect of the heart. "Such things do happen, especially to the high-strung," he said, glancing once at the candle but saying nothing more of it. The girl was 22. Colonel Harcourt, upright despite his cane and age, watched them all with narrowed eyes as the household dissolved into careful whispers. Clara was not ill, he said to no one in particular, and if she had changed her will, as she told me last week she intended to do, then someone may have had very real cause to wish her dead. It was 3 days later that Hercule Poirot arrived, summoned not by panic but by doubt. I must confess I was glad of the interruption. The countryside is all well and good in moderation, but too much of it leaves one susceptible to philosophical brooding and indigestion. Poirot, by contrast, was thoroughly in his element. "You see, Hastings," he said as we approached Ashcombe Hall in a rattling hired car, "it is not the death itself which is suspicious, it is the flame." "The candle?" I asked, somewhat baffled. "Just so." Poirot's moustaches twitched. "A candle lit in the evening, extinguished by the maid, and yet burning still in the morning. One may say a draught relit it, or the maid lied, or even that Miss Ashcombe rose in the night and relit it herself. But why would she do so, and then not read the book beside her?" He shook his head gently. "Non, mon ami, there is disorder where there should be order, and that is always a sign. Ashcombe Hall, when we arrived, was everything a proper country house ought to be. Grey-stoned, ivy-strewn, with gables too narrow and chimneys too many. Colonel Harcourt greeted us in the drawing-room, a whisky in hand despite the early hour. He was a military man through and through, though softened by grief. She wasn't the sort to go quietly, he said after a brief pause. Clara had the spirit of her mother, a damnably perceptive woman. Wouldn't surprise me if she'd seen something she shouldn't have. Poirot inclined his head. "Perhaps you can show me her room." Cray, the butler, led us up the stairs, his gait measured, his face unreadable. Poirot observed everything: the worn patch on the stair-runner, the angle of a lampshade, the faint trace of something scratched into the banister at waist height. In the bedroom, Poirot walked without, speaking. He studied the wax trail down the candle's side, the placement of the book, the creases in the chaise's cushion. "Tell me," he said at last, "was the window open when she was found?" "No, monsieur. Locked tight." "And the key to the room?" "Still in the lock, sir. On the inside." Poirot nodded once. "A room that locks itself, and a candle that lights itself, and a young lady with no illness who dies of the heart. Curious, is it not?" I must admit the scene gave me little to grasp. It all looked so ordinary. Too ordinary, in fact. Poirot examined the bureau next, his fingers brushing the brass handles with delicate precision. "There is something missing," he murmured. "Or rather, something that ought to be missing." Before I could ask, a soft voice interrupted us. "I always said she was too sensitive for this place." We turned to see a young man standing at the threshold, tall, fair, and composed in the way only the truly uncertain manage. He introduced himself as Lucien Vale, a childhood friend of Clara's, visiting the village for a few weeks. She didn't like storms, he said. Would sit up all night rather than sleep through. I think she was afraid of something. Or someone. Poirot gave him a long, thoughtful look. But not, it seems, afraid of death. Lucien gave a half-smile. No, not death. Something worse. Colonel Harcourt called us down to luncheon then, and Lucien excused himself. At the table we met Iris, Clara's cousin, a pretty girl of about 19 with a watchful expression. She spoke little, and when she did it was always in the form of a question. "Did you notice how calm she looked?" she asked at one point, not looking at anyone in particular, as if she'd just remembered something she'd forgotten for years. Later, as Poirot and I walked the grounds, he turned to me with a peculiar glint in his eye. "There is something most irregular, Hastings," he said. "The candle. Yes, always the candle. But more than that. The room told no lie, but it did not tell the whole truth. Someone took care to arrange it just so. That is never the action of panic. It is the signature of intention. And yet the doctor said, 'Doctors see what is medically probable. I see what is humanly possible.'" He stopped, brow furrowing. "Tell me, would you die with your book unopened and your slippers mismatched?" I was about to answer when he held up a hand. "And more importantly, would you die without even a cry if the person who came to see you was someone you trusted?" He said no more, but as we returned to the house I could not shake the feeling that Poirot had already begun to see the shape of something in the fog, something no one else yet suspected. The next morning he returned to Clara's room alone. He spent a long time examining the soles of her shoes. I asked him afterward what he had found. "An impression," he said quietly. "A most telling impression." And though he would say nothing more, I noticed he had become suddenly very interested in the length of time it takes wax to melt, and the curious absence of any matches near the candle. It was that afternoon that the maid, pale and trembling, confessed to Poirot that she had extinguished the candle and had found it still burning when she entered the next morning. "I don't understand it," she whispered. "I know I blew it out. I know I did." Poirot merely nodded. "Then we must ask mademoiselle who lit it again, and why." I saw then that look in his eyes, that sharp gleam beneath the civility, like flint under velvet. Whatever he had seen in that room, it was not just a flame, it was a signal. Something had begun. Something no one at Ashcombe Hall, save Hercule Poirot, was yet prepared to see. When Hercule Poirot is quiet, I have come to learn that it is not due to lack of thought, quite the opposite. It is, rather, the hush before a calculation, like the space between numbers in a formula only he could see. He was silent that evening, after speaking with the maid, and remained so through supper. The others, Colonel Harcourt, Iris, Lucien Vale, and a pair of minor cousins whose names I immediately forgot, made small talk over roast chicken and parsnips, as though it were not strange to sit in the shadow of a young woman's sudden death. It was Poirot who broke the silence at last, gently laying his napkin beside his untouched pudding. "Pardon, Colonel. Might I observe Miss Ashcombe's room once more?" This time at the hour she's said to have retired. The Colonel, caught mid-sip of port, raised a brow. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. Cray will assist you." "Merci, but I should prefer to go alone this time, if I may, to preserve the stillness of the scene." Poirot rose with a quiet nod and excused himself. I made to follow, but he waved a hand. "Remain, Hastings. Regard, observe, listen," which is precisely what I did. Lucien Vale leaned back in his chair, his fork idle. "I still don't see the point of all this," he said in a low voice. "The doctor said it was natural causes." Iris, Clara's cousin, barely out of girlhood, spoke without looking at him. "Then why did Uncle Harcourt send for a detective?" Lucien's expression tightened. "That's a question for your uncle, not me." Colonel Harcourt cleared his throat. "It's the candle, as I said, the candle, and something in her manner that last week. She was unsettled, preoccupied." "She was often preoccupied," Iris said. "She lived half in books and half in her own head." "Not like this," the Colonel replied. "She seemed hunted." It was a word that clung unpleasantly in the air. I glanced at Iris. She looked down, her hands clenched in her lap. 20 minutes later, Poirot returned. He made no pronouncement, merely resumed his seat, requested tea, and sat back, eyes closed, fingers gently steepled. It was not until the following morning, over breakfast, that he began again. "Hastings," he said, "come, let us take a little walk in the garden." The grounds of Ashcombe Hall were pleasant enough, not ostentatious, but kept with the sort of care that speaks of inherited pride. We strolled past hedgerows glistening with dew, and under a row of yew trees that had seen many generations. "Come and go." Poirot was frowning at the gravel underfoot. "Clara Ashcombe," he said at last, "was a girl of order, precision. I looked through her desk. The stationery arranged just so. Books by size, pens aligned, shoes facing forward beneath. The chaise. A place for everything, yes? Quite so. And yet," he continued, "her slippers mismatched. Her book and unopened. The candle relit. The window locked. Why would a girl of such habits undress halfway and then lie back on a chaise to read but not read at all? Shock, I offered. Exhaustion? Possibly. But let us take it further. She writes a letter, yet does not post it. She has matches, yet they are gone. She blows out a candle, but it burns still. All of these things are too untidy." "Someone arranged it," he smiled. "Now you are using the little grey cells, mon ami. Yes, someone arranged it, or rearranged it, which tells us two things. They had time, and they had calm." We rounded the edge of the terrace, and I caught sight of the butler, Cray, speaking, lowly with the housekeeper, Mrs. Marple. Their tone was hushed, their faces stiff. As soon as they noticed us, they separated with a degree of formality that seemed almost theatrical. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "That is not the ease of long time. Colleagues, Hastings, that is the discomfort of shared knowledge." We returned inside. Poirot requested permission to examine the letter Clara had left on her writing desk. It had not been sealed, only folded. Colonel Harcourt handed it over reluctantly. "It's to her solicitor," he said. "Or rather, it would have been. She was making changes to her will. Said she no longer trusted the arrangement." Poirot read the note, his eyes darting gently across the page. "Interesting. She does not name a beneficiary, merely states her intent to revoke a clause and reassign her assets. No specifics, and yet she does not post it." He looked up sharply. "Why not?" Lucien, who had entered behind us unnoticed, replied softly. "Because she was still making up her mind." Poirot turned to him. "You were close to her, Monsieur Vale, were you not?" Lucien hesitated. "Yes. We were friends, since childhood. And recently, he shifted. She was distant. Distracted. She said something odd 2 days before she died." Poirot waited. She said, "I've been sleeping badly. There's someone in the house I no longer recognize." There was a pause. Poirot's eyes did not move. "Did she say, 'Who?'" Lucien shook his head. "No, I assumed it was nerves." Poirot walked to the mantelpiece and adjusted a crooked ornament, a habit of his I'd seen many times before. "Or perhaps," he murmured, "she saw something that could not be unseen, a truth she had not expected." There was a silence. Then Iris spoke from the doorway. "She asked me to lend her my room that night," she said quietly. "Said hers felt unquiet. I refused. I thought she was being melodramatic." Poirot turned slowly. "Did she mention the candle?" Iris blinked. "No." Poirot's gaze lingered on her face. I could not read his expression. Later, as we retired to the study, Poirot stood before the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. "Hastings," he said softly, "there is a psychology to firelight. It creates intimacy, yes? Shadows, warmth. People say things in candlelight they would not in sunlight." I nodded. "Then imagine," he continued, "you come to speak to Clara Ashcombe under the veil of night. You wish to tell her something, or to extract something. The candle is lit, it goes out, it is relit. Why? To continue the conversation. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was not conversation at all. Perhaps it was silence. That burned." He looked at the letter again. "She wrote it. She left it unsealed. She did not post it. Perhaps she could not." He tapped the paper once lightly, because someone was already watching. He said nothing more that day. But that night, as we prepared to turn in, He paused at the top of the stairs. "A candle does not burn itself back to life, mon ami," he said softly. "Someone has relit it." And though I could not have said why, a chill crept across my spine as he turned away. The next morning, Poirot commenced his methodical parade of interviews, or, as he liked to put it, a gentle turning of the soil to see what seeds have taken root, eh bien? He was never abrupt, never accusing. One might almost forget in the calm civility of his voice that his business was murder. We began with Iris, seated stiffly in the morning room with her tea gone cold beside her. She told you she felt the room was— What was the word? Poirot asked, settling into a low chair with his hands folded like a priest receiving confession. "Unquiet," Iris replied. "Yes, but she could be fanciful, Clara. She read too many novels." "You say that often, mademoiselle, that she was imaginative, distant. Did others agree?" "I don't know." She hesitated. "Lucien thought she brooded too much. He has said she was changing." "Changing in what way?" "She had grown more private, defensive, almost suspicious, and short-tempered. Not like her. I put it down to the will business." "That's when she truly became odd." Poirot leaned forward, his tone light. "You knew she was changing her will?" "She told me. She said she was tired of being expected." Those were her words. Tired of everyone thinking they knew, or what she owed them. I asked her what she meant, but she said only that she'd made arrangements. "And did you, mademoiselle, expect anything?" Iris looked away. "I'm not ashamed to say I hoped. Clara had no siblings. We were close. Once, but it wasn't a matter of greed." Poirot inclined his head. "Naturally. Besides," she added with a small, brittle smile, "Charles would have got most of it." "Ah, yes. Mr. Penryn." Poirot rose, giving no hint of conclusion or judgment. "Merci, mademoiselle." Lucien was next. He looked rumpled and less rehearsed. His answers came more slowly. She said odd things, he told us, that she felt watched, that someone had entered her room and moved things, that she'd left the candle unlit and found it burning. I frowned. "But you said nothing of this before," he sighed, "because it sounded mad. Clara wasn't well." Poirot's eyes flicked upward. "Physically?" "I'm not sure. She never said. But she had that look, like someone always calculating what they couldn't quite see." "You did not believe her fears?" Lucien rubbed his jaw. "No, but now I don't know." Poirot was silent a moment. "And the will?" "I didn't know she was changing it until after. Harcourt told me. But it makes sense, I suppose. Lately she'd been questioning everything. Charles, most of all." "Indeed," Lucien hesitated. "He was charming, of course. But she didn't trust easily. Not when it came to money." Poirot nodded once, then dismissed him. "Merci, monsieur." The maid, Elsie, was next, round-faced, red-eyed, and still pale from the shock. "I tell you, sir," she said, wringing her hands, "I blew out that candle myself, like always. Miss Clara liked things neat before bed." "You did not light it again?" "Certainly not." "I turned the gas off in the corridor, too. She was particular about that." "And you are quite sure it was out when you left?" "Yes, sir, I always double-check." Poirot gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Then someone else must have entered. But did you hear anything, sense anything strange that night?" "No, sir, not a thing." "Did anyone else go upstairs after Miss Ashcombe retired?" She swallowed. "I don't know for sure. Well, Mrs. Marple, she said she saw a light under the door some time later. I thought she was mistaken." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Marple said that?" The maid looked suddenly unsure. "Yes, or I think so. She said something about the candle not being fully out, but that's not true." Poirot did not press her further. He merely thanked her with such gravity that the poor girl looked near, tears by the time she left. Mrs. Marple, when we found her in the linen room, was cooler than I expected, a woman of iron-starched composure. "I made my rounds late that night," she said, as usual. "I passed Miss Clara's room and thought I saw light. Not much, just a flicker. I thought perhaps she'd relit the candle herself." "You did not investigate?" "No, sir. She was private, Miss Clara. I wasn't about to intrude." Poirot's brow furrowed. "But the maid claims she blew out the candle. that it was out when she left. Mrs. Maple's expression did not change. She's a nervous girl. She may have thought it was out. And you yourself saw light on, or thought you did? She paused. Yes. Poirot tilted his head slightly. And was the door open, or only the light visible from beneath it? From beneath, he nodded. Merci, madame. You may go. When she had gone, I turned to him. Elsie's certain. Mrs. Maple says otherwise. Someone is lying. Poirot smiled faintly. Or someone is remembering selectively. We had not been long in the study when Colonel Harcourt announced that Mr. Charles Penryn had arrived. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a finely tailored suit, the sort who might have been described as solid by those who liked him, and calculating by those who did not. His greeting to Poirot was formal, almost brusque. I don't see the point of raking through everything again, he said. Clara's death was tragic, but she was fragile. The doctor confirmed. Poirot gave a gracious nod. You were engaged? Yes, Clara and I had plans. We were to go to Italy in April. She was excited. In fact, I have a letter she wrote me. It arrived the morning after. He handed Poirot a folded sheet, monogrammed and dated 2 days before her death. It was warm, affectionate, full of talk of spring and Florence and paintings she longed to see. Poirot read it twice. A hopeful letter, he said quietly, and curious. Curious. Penryn narrowed his eyes. Poirot merely tapped the date. 2 days before she rewrote her will. Penryn stiffened. She changed her will? You did not know? No. Poirot said nothing more. The silence pressed between them like a third party. There was talk, Poirot continued after a pause, of a business matter some years ago. A certain accusation of irregularities. Penryn's jaw tensed. A competitor, with a grudge. Nothing came of it. But Miss Ashcombe may have discovered it. She did, he said tightly. I told her myself I was transparent, and if you read that letter, you'll see she forgave me. Poirot gave the faintest of nods. It was late that afternoon, as we reviewed the interviews, that Poirot returned to the chaise where Clara had been found. He picked up the book said to have been at her side. Wives and Daughters, a rather worn edition. He opened it, flipped through, and held up the first few pages. Uncut, he said simply. I blinked. What? Poirot pointed. The pages have not been separated. She could not have read past page 12. But then she meant to read, yes. She changed perhaps for bed. She arranged the room, but she never read. She never relaxed. Something stopped her. Someone, I said slowly. He gave a small nod, his eyes unreadable. Someone whose presence required silence and a candle. Poirot returned to Clara's bedroom with a calm that belied the cold logic already at work in his mind. I followed, a step behind, the gloom of the storm still heavy against the windows, as though the weather itself conspired to hold the house in solemn hush. He stood for a long moment at the threshold, surveying the room once more with those sharp, methodical eyes. Something here does not please you? I asked. Au contraire, mon ami, he murmured. Everything is too pleasing. That is what offends me. He moved to the writing desk first. The untouched letter still lay where we had found it. Poirot did not touch it this time. He had already committed its position, its folds, to memory, but he glanced at it with renewed scrutiny, then turned toward the window. The draperies had been drawn again since the constable's initial check, but Poirot drew them back with care. His fingers skimmed the wood of the frame, pausing suddenly at the base of the left-hand casement. Regardez, he said softly. I leaned in. There, along the sill, were 2 faint smudges, no larger than a thumbprint, though elongated and dark. Soot? I asked. He nodded. Oui, and more than that, observe the edge, the faint mark here where the wood is paler. The window was opened. Yes, briefly. And not by Clara. She was fastidious. She would never have left the frame with such gleam. Besides, he opened the window slightly, then closed it. It sticks just so. One must use both hands, with effort. A gust of wind from outside stirred the curtains, and I shivered. In this weather, I said. Good Lord, it was lashing. Rain that night. No one in their senses would have opened a window. Poirot said nothing. He moved slowly downward, kneeling, not easy for a man of his age, though he did it with surprising grace, and studied the interior ledge. There, faint, but distinct against the polished wood, was a small scuff, barely visible, as if from a shoe or perhaps a heel, dragged over it in haste. He remained kneeling for a few moments more, his gaze travelling outward toward the shrubbery below the window. Then, rising, he moved to the vanity. A few combs, a small box of face powder, a delicate bottle of perfume, and a single hairpin near the foot of the bed where it had no business being. He held it up between thumb and forefinger. "You see this, Hastings? Of course, but surely that's Clara's." "No." He held it nearer the light. "It is lacquered dark, yes, but slightly bent at the tip. Clara's pins were silver and uniform. I counted them on her dressing tray. She kept them lined like soldiers. This is an intruder." "A lady visitor, perhaps?" Poirot gave me a look. And yet no visitor was announced. No one entered or left the house after dinner. Everyone says so. This is not a house. With many comings and goings. Then the murderer is a woman? Poirot said nothing to that. Instead, he moved to the nightstand and examined the candle once more. He tilted it slightly, then bent over the base. With the smallest of murmurs, he removed something with his tweezers and placed it on a blotting sheet. "Wax?" I guessed. "No. Char." He dabbed it gently. "A residue of the wick. Notice the color. It is unevenly burned. And here, do you see the twist at the base? That tells us the wick was lit, extinguished, then relit before it cooled fully. It burned with a reluctance." "I still don't understand what you meant earlier," I said. "Why strike a match in a storm?" Poirot stood, brushing his cuffs. "Because the electricity was off for a mere 20 minutes, not long enough to matter, unless one needed precise timing in the dark. And yet, one did not use the gas lamp. One used a candle. To see something," Poirot's brow furrowed, "or to hide something. The candle gives only a small circle of light, n'est-ce pas? It does not illuminate the room. Only a little. Pool. Perhaps that is what was desired. Secrecy." He turned then, his gaze fixing briefly on the fireplace. I followed it. The ash had not been swept. There were no fresh logs, no sign of recent use. Yet something gleamed faintly beneath the grate. Poirot reached in with the tongs and withdrew a charred scrap of fabric. It crumbled almost at once, but I caught a glimpse. Blue, perhaps velvet. Poirot held it up briefly, then let it fall into a handkerchief. "That," he said softly, "was not part of Clara's wardrobe." We stood silent for a moment. Then Poirot's gaze drifted again toward the bed. "The shoes, Hastings. Still side by side, neatly aligned, not disturbed by sleep. It suggests she lay down only briefly. But she wore her nightdress, yes? Why undress, if one is not truly ready to sleep? To make it seem so, I offered. Or because one was summoned." Poirot turned. "By someone known, trusted, and therefore alarming." "You think she knew her killer?" He nodded, almost imperceptibly. There was a knock then. Harcourt entered, his usual stiffness sharpened now by unease. "I thought you should know," he said. "Charles Penryn has left." "Left?" I said, without saying goodbye. "Packed a bag. Drove off before breakfast." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Did he say where?" "No. But he told the valet something peculiar, that he wasn't needed anymore. Not by Clara. Not by anyone here." Poirot did not move. He stared at the scorched wick in the candle as though it spoke. Then, turning slowly, he murmured to himself, "The flame was not meant to light the room. It was meant to signal in the dark." Stared at him. "Signal whom?" He did not answer. Only as we stepped out of Clara's room and into the dim hush of the corridor, his hand brushed the banister and his voice, very low, said, "It is no longer a matter of who entered the room, Hastings. It is who expected." Not to be seen. The house felt taut that morning, like a violin string too finely wound. The storm had passed, but a heavier tension remained, human and lingering. Conversations quieted as Poirot moved from room to room, his presence like a slow-turning mirror, revealing what was meant to be hidden. He had asked to speak with Iris again, and she came to him in the small library where Clara used to read in the afternoons. The light through the tall windows cast the girl's profile in pale defiance, though her fingers twisted a handkerchief until it was nothing but knots. "You were close with your cousin, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked gently. Of course. She did not meet his gaze. "We grew up together, but not always as friends, perhaps." Her mouth thinned. Clara had a way of taking up space. People deferred to her, even when she was wrong. "There is no shame in envy, mademoiselle," said Poirot softly. "It is a most human thing. But when it is denied, then it becomes dangerous." She looked at him sharply, then away. Again. "She kept things to herself, you know. Secrets. She was writing a letter the day before she died, locked her door while she wrote it. And she burned another, I think. I saw her tear something up by the hearth and throw the pieces into the flames. I only caught a glimpse. It was in her handwriting, but not addressed to anyone." Poirot leaned forward. "And did she say what troubled her?" Iris hesitated. "She only said, 'I know too much and I don't know who to trust.' That was it. Then she went pale and changed the subject." Poirot's eyes flicked to the fireplace across the room. "Would you say Clara feared someone within this house?" "I think she didn't know what to fear," Iris said, "which is worse." Poirot let the silence stretch just a moment too long before giving a gracious nod. Iris stood, but as she reached the door, she turned slightly. "You should speak with Lucien," she said. "He liked to act above it all, but he hated not being the center of things. And Clara had changed something in her will, didn't she? She told me I'd understand soon, but it was Lucien who seemed most unsettled after that conversation." She slipped away. Poirot remained seated for some time. When he rose, he made no move to pursue Lucien just yet. Instead, he asked Colonel Harcourt to summon Elsie, the young maid. She came with reluctance, hands wringing her apron, and a nervous twitch at the corner of her mouth that had deepened since the night before. Poirot gestured for her to sit, but she did not. "You were fond of your mistress, mademoiselle?" "Oh, yes, sir, she was always fair to me, strict but kind." "And yet you were to be dismissed." Elsie's eyes darted upward. "Who told you that?" Poirot smiled kindly. "I see many things. It is no shame, mademoiselle, to speak plainly. Was it recent?" "She told me a week ago. Said I'd done nothing wrong, only she was cutting down the staff." "Said there were things she had to do differently now?" Poirot nodded. "And the night of her death you saw something, did you not?" Her lips pressed together. Then, after a pause, "I saw Mr. Lucien. He was in the West Wing corridor. I'd come to check the windows. There was a draft. I saw him go into her study. Was he aware of your presence?" I don't think so." "He was in a hurry." "And you told no one?" "She was already gone the next morning, and Mr. Lucien said he'd been in the drawing room the whole time with Mr. Penryn." Poirot's eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly. "Did you see Mr. Penryn?" "Caswell? No, sir, only Mr. Lucien." There was a pause, then Poirot asked so gently it almost floated past, "Your brother, he has debts, does he not?" Her head snapped up. "That's nothing to do with this." "But perhaps it is. If you were dismissed, your brother's situation becomes difficult, n'est-ce pas? Perhaps someone offered help." "No one offered me anything," she said. "Fiercely, no?" Poirot tilted his head. "Not even money in exchange for silence." "I would never," she whispered. But the denial rang hollow. Poirot said nothing further, only bowed his head and allowed her to leave. When she had gone, I turned to him. "You believe she's lying?" "Not about what she saw, Hastings. About what she did not see, and why she waited until now to say it. She's frightened. May we? And fear, when it clouds the truth, makes even an honest witness unreliable." We found Lucien, not long after, seated by the billiard table with a brandy untouched beside him. He had the strained, dry-eyed look of a man rehearsing his own alibi. "You've spoken to the maid," he said, without greeting. Poirot nodded. "She says she saw you in the West Wing." Lucien gave a short, humorless laugh. "And of course, you believe her?" Poirot shrugged. "I believe facts. They are more loyal than people. I was in the drawing room with Penryn, and yet he has left." Lucien's jaw clenched. Clara's death is a tragedy, but this is theatre. Poirot made a small gesture, as if brushing dust from his sleeve. Tell me, monsieur, why did Clara change her will? Lucien stared at him. I don't know. But you suspected. She was giving more to Iris, I think. Some argument about responsibility, sentiment. She and I disagreed about certain family matters. Poirot's eyes flicked upward. Ah yes, the mother. She casts quite the long shadow, does she not? Lucien's eyes narrowed. You know about her? Only what the house allows me to see. A portrait here in the hallway. A likeness with Clara, same mouth, same shape of thought behind the eyes. Tell me, did Clara confide in her mother's portrait, I wonder? Lucien stood. This is absurd. Poirot watched him go, but he did not rise. Instead, he stepped to the portrait itself. Regal, imperious, a matriarch rendered in oil and secrets. He stared at it a long while. Then, very softly, he said, The mother's power is not in what she said. It is in what was never said at all. And in the silence that followed, he turned just once toward the corridor where Clara's room waited, and the west wing loomed. The house had a certain stillness about it now, as though the air itself held its breath, waiting for the next. A revelation. Outside, the early morning mist still clung to the ground, thickening the silence and blurring the distant outlines of trees. Inside, we waited for the telegram. Poirot, ever the picture of calm, had remained in his study, his gaze occasionally flickering to the clock, but otherwise absorbed in some quiet, private contemplation. I had no doubt his thoughts were already leaping forward, piecing together the small puzzle I could only half see. When the telegram finally arrived, the news was clear and concise, as expected. Charles Penryn's alibi had been confirmed. He was indeed at the theatre with several witnesses at the time Clara was murdered. His name, at least for the moment, was cleared. Poirot read the message once, twice, then he handed it to me, still without a word. Penny for your thoughts, mon. Ami? I asked, watching him as he folded the paper with slow deliberation. It is as I thought, Poirot murmured. Mr. Penryn is innocent of this particular crime. But the question remains, who else is guilty? I glanced at the telegram again, weighing its significance, but Poirot had already moved on, his mind shifting as deftly as a chess master, preparing for his next move. Within the hour we were in the sitting room, the faint scent of burning wood filling the air. I had no sooner seated myself than the housekeeper, Mrs. Bennet, entered carrying a small bundle of charred papers. Poirot raised an eyebrow. What is this, mademoiselle? Mrs. Bennet's hands were shaking as she adjusted her apron. I was simply following the orders of Miss Clara, sir. She asked me to burn some old correspondence, letters that no longer served any purpose. May I see them? She hesitated, the fingers that had been so sure in their work only moments before now twitching nervously. At Poirot's steady look, she relented and placed the bundle before him. He began to unroll the edges of the burnt papers with his usual delicate care, and I could see his lips tighten imperceptibly as he worked. Strange, he said at last, his voice almost to himself. This handwriting, it does not match Miss Clara's. Sir? Mrs. Bennet's voice trembled as if she had not quite understood. Poirot's eyes did not leave the letters as he continued to unroll the fragments, his mind already several steps ahead. These letters, they were not from Miss Clara, were they? They were written by someone else, someone who wished to cover their tracks. The housekeeper's breath caught in her throat. I don't know what you mean, sir. Poirot leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Of course you don't, mademoiselle, but someone in this house perhaps has something to hide. A chill ran through the room, though none of us moved. Mrs. Bennet began to back away, but Poirot's voice, cool and insistent, stopped her. Not yet, mademoiselle. You will stay here with us a little longer. And so she did. Poirot set the letters aside with deliberate care, as though their secrets would eventually make themselves known. But before he could press her further, a knock at the door interrupted. It was a messenger from the neighbouring estate, Miss Dalloway. Poirot, now looking both intrigued and slightly amused, gestured for the man to enter. Miss Dalloway, sir? She insists on speaking with you. The messenger stepped aside, revealing the older woman standing just outside. Miss Dalloway, known for her eccentricities and penchant for dramatic gestures, swept into the room with an air of urgency. "I must speak to you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, almost breathless. "I saw something last night. Something I cannot—" "Ignore," Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Go on, mademoiselle." "It was late. After the storm had passed, I was walking my dog along the lane when I saw a figure near the servants' door. A person, clad in a dark, rain-soaked cloak. They were moving quickly, but I could see it was no servant. They walked like a man, but I couldn't make out his face. It was too dark, and the rain—" "A man," Poirot interjected, his voice sharp. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot, I'm certain of it. I could barely make out the figure, but the cloak, it was so unusual, so dramatic, almost as though they didn't care whether they were seen." "Did you see anyone else, mademoiselle? Anyone else in the vicinity?" Miss Dalloway shook her head, her face pale. "No, but I'm sure of what I saw. Someone was there, near the door." Poirot seemed to ponder this for a moment, his gaze moving from Miss Dalloway to Mrs. Bennet, who had remained rigidly silent, her eyes downcast. "I see," Poirot said slowly. "And yet, mademoiselle, everyone within the house, every person I have questioned, denies having gone outside that night." Miss Dalloway flinched. "I am not mistaken, Monsieur Poirot. I saw him. Poirot raised a hand to silence her. "I do not doubt you, mademoiselle. But we must ask ourselves why the figure you saw, whoever he might have been, would choose that particular hour and that particular spot. Why, when no one else in the house ventured outdoors?" Miss Dalloway looked as though she might protest, but then her shoulders slumped and she gave a weary sigh. "I don't know, sir. I only know what I saw." Poirot turned back to Mrs. Bennet, his eyes piercing. "What was Clara doing, mademoiselle, in those last days? She had many concerns, didn't she?" Mrs. Bennet's expression flickered, betraying a hint of something, guilt, fear. She took a slow breath and answered, "She was troubled, very troubled. But I don't know what about. She asked me to burn the letters, and I did as she told me." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "And if she had been trying to hide something, what might she have done?" Mrs. Bennet began, but she faltered, her voice breaking on the edge of the question. Poirot shifted his weight slightly, leaning forward. "You see, mademoiselle, what you must understand is this. There are many things hidden in this house, behind many closed doors, and some of those doors are locked by the very people who would stand to lose the most if they were opened." Mrs. Bennet's hands trembled. I will ask you once more, mademoiselle. What was Clara hiding?" "She did not—" "Answer." Poirot stood, his eyes scanning the room with an intensity that seemed to draw the very air toward him. After a long pause, he finally spoke, almost to himself. "Guilt is often mistaken for grief, Hastings. But I wonder, when grief wears a mask, does it hide sorrow, or does it hide something worse?" And with that he turned and walked toward the door, leaving the room heavy with unspoken questions. The house had grown colder since the telegram had arrived. The air felt thick with secrets, with hidden things, and I could see them weighing on Poirot as we moved through the day. His mind, as usual, was several steps ahead, while I struggled to keep up. It was as though he could see everything but was waiting, patiently, meticulously, for the pieces to fall into place. We had returned to the drawing-room after the last exchange with Miss Dalloway, and Poirot had immediately begun his quiet work. It was no surprise that he had requested Lucienne Vale to be brought to him, though what he intended I could not quite guess. There was something different about the way he asked for it, a shift in his tone that spoke more of inevitability than inquiry. By the time Lucienne Vale entered the room, his usual air of self-assurance had been replaced by a thin veneer of tension. His eyes darted about the room nervously, his posture rigid. He was clearly aware that something had changed, though he didn't know exactly what. "Ah, Monsieur Vale," Poirot said, with that subtle smile of his, half amused, half serious. "A moment of your time, if you please." Lucien hesitated before taking the seat Poirot indicated. "What is it, Poirot?" His voice, once smooth and confident, now held a tremor I had not heard before. Poirot did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the man with an almost unnerving intensity. Instead, he stood up and began pacing slowly across the room, his hand tapping a rhythm against his chin. There was no rush in his movements. He was savoring the moment. "The truth is a curious thing, Monsieur Vale," Poirot began, his voice lilting with the familiar cadence of a riddle. "It has a way of hiding itself in plain sight. Sometimes it wears a mask, but it is still there, isn't it?" Lucien blinked, his expression unreadable. "I don't follow." Poirot's eyes met his, sharp and penetrating. "I have been thinking of you, Monsieur Vale, and of the manner in which you have presented yourself to us. How the name of Lucien Vale has been so carefully wrapped in mystery." He paused, letting the silence settle heavily between them. "But you are not Lucien Vale, are you?" The words seemed to hit the air like a thunderclap. I looked at Poirot, my mind racing as I tried to follow his train of thought. Lucien's face paled slightly, and for the briefest moment I thought... I saw his eyes flicker with something, fear, or was it surprise? It was gone in an instant, replaced by an almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. "What nonsense is this?" Lucien demanded, trying for deflection, but his voice wavered. "I am Lucien Vale. Who else would I be?" Poirot stepped closer, his voice dropping to a soft murmur, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "You are Martin Vale, Lucien's half-brother. I believe it is time for you to confess." The colour drained from Lucien's face. His lips parted, but no sound came for a long moment. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you—" "Ah, but it is simple, my friend. The shipwreck, the disappearance of Lucien Vale, it all fits, does it not? You assumed his identity after the tragedy. No one suspected, for why would they? Who would doubt a man who claims to be someone else?" I could see Lucien's hands, trembling ever so slightly, clenched into fists in his lap. His gaze fell to the floor, and for a long moment he seemed to gather his thoughts, perhaps even his courage, before he looked up again. "Why would you think such a thing, Poirot?" he asked, though the question was more of a challenge than anything else. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Clara, she knew, she had discovered the truth just before her death. She was going to expose you, was she not? Lucien's face remained a mask, but there was a flicker of something, guilt or was it regret, in his eyes. He didn't answer right away, and in that silence, Poirot pressed further. "I found something, you see," Poirot continued, his voice calm. "Another hairpin like the one we found earlier in Clara's room. It was hidden inside a secret compartment in her jewelry box. A hiding place, wouldn't you say? A place where a secret might be kept from prying eyes." I could see the blood drain from Lucien's face, his fingers tightening around the arms of the chair, as though trying to steady himself. "And not just the hairpin," Poirot went on, his voice smooth, steady. "I also found a letter. A love letter, unsigned but clearly written with passion. Clara had been planning to expose someone, but to whom, I wonder?" Lucien's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. His eyes darted around the room, and I could almost see his mind working furiously, calculating whether he could find a way out, whether he could lie his way through this. Poirot leaned in slightly, his voice lowering, almost a whisper. "Do you know what I think, Monsieur Vale? I think Clara discovered your true identity. I think she realized who you were and what that meant. You were the one she intended to expose, and perhaps that was why she had to die." Lucien flinched. The weight of Poirot's words landed like a heavy blow, and I could feel the tension rising in the room, but Poirot was not done. "Your story is full of holes, Monsieur Vale, and now we come to the truth of it. What do you have to say for yourself?" Lucien opened his mouth, but no words came. For a long moment he seemed at a loss, his mind racing for a way out of the corner Poirot had trapped him in. He was still trying to hold on to his illusion, to the lie that had kept him hidden in plain sight, but Poirot was not fooled. "You are not the man you say you are," Poirot said quietly, his voice soft but final. "And the truth, mon ami, will come out, whether you speak it or not." Lucien's expression twisted and he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His hand reached for the door handle, but before he could make his exit, Poirot spoke again, the words soft but full of weight. "I wonder, Hastings," Poirot said, turning to me with that same inscrutable look. "When one wears a mask for Too long, does it begin to become part of them? Or does it always remain something they struggle to remove? I could see the question linger in the air, unanswered. Lucien's footsteps echoed down the hall, but I had the strange sensation that we were no closer to uncovering all the secrets that lay beneath his facade. The house was in chaos when I arrived at breakfast the next morning. No one seemed to know exactly what had happened, but the housekeeper, Mrs. Crawford, was gone. The servants had come down to find her room empty, a suitcase hastily packed and left by the door. The bed was still unmade, the curtains drawn, but she was nowhere to be found. I could hear her name being murmured by the staff as I entered the drawing room, where Poirot was standing by the fireplace, his brow furrowed in thought. He had that look of someone deep in a puzzle, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, or someone to make the next move. "Mon ami," Poirot said without turning, his voice sharp but measured. "I think we are nearing the end of our game, though the players are becoming desperate." I nodded, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding around us. "Is she truly gone, Mrs. Crawford?" Poirot turned slowly, his gaze lingering on the empty room. "She is indeed gone, Hastings. And yet, as with everything else in this house, there is more to her disappearance than meets the eye." He glanced at the table, where a telegram had been hastily laid out, its message unspoken but ominous. The others had only just begun to trickle in. Elsie, the maid, Penryn, still pale and wary, and Lucien Vale, though his true name was now all but revealed. They all looked uneasy, glancing at each other, unsure of who to trust. Poirot remained calm, his small frame seemingly unaffected by the rising tension. He directed the servants to gather in the drawing-room for a meeting, but there was no use. In waiting longer, the air was thick with accusation and fear. "I'm afraid, mon cher, that the housekeeper's absence is not merely a matter of her deciding to leave," Poirot said, his eyes flicking to the suitcase on the floor, still open and half-filled. "The timing is far too perfect. There is something more at play here, something hidden in the shadows." I stood still, watching the others, their faces like masks of panic and uncertainty. Mrs. Crawford had been a quiet, unobtrusive figure, one whose presence was felt more through the duties she performed than any force of personality. Her sudden disappearance could only be the result of something deeply unsettling. Poirot's next words were quiet, but they carried a weight. "And we will soon learn what that is." A sharp gasp drew my attention. I turned to see Elsie standing near the hearth, her hand frozen mid-air as though she had been about to place something onto the fire. Her expression was one of alarm, but Poirot's eyes, calm and calculating, were already on her. "What is this, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked, stepping closer. Elsie quickly pulled her hand back, and I saw that what she had been holding was a piece of wax. A small, half-burned candle, its color a peculiar shade of dark red, unlike any wax I had seen before. I could almost hear the others holding their breath as Poirot took the wax in his fingers, inspecting it closely. "The fire, it consumes many things," Poirot murmured, his tone distant as he examined the charred remnants. "But this is something. More than simple waste. No, mademoiselle, the person who burned this was not burning away the past, but a future threat." Elsie's eyes widened in panic. "It was nothing, Monsieur Poirot, just some things from the old study that I didn't want anyone to find. I didn't know it would be noticed," but Poirot did not seem convinced. He was already examining the wax again, as though trying to decipher its true meaning. "The timing is curious," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "Very curious indeed." I watched him closely, a sense of unease creeping over me. It was becoming clearer to me now that there were too many pieces of the puzzle falling into place too quickly. Clara had known something that had prompted her to make plans for exposure. Lucien Vale, whoever he truly was, had secrets. That might have cost him everything. And now Mrs. Crawford had vanished, leaving behind only questions. Poirot's voice cut through my thoughts. "We are nearing the truth, my friend, but first we must gather them all, every one of them. Tomorrow night at the latest, everyone shall be present. All must be accounted for." The tension in the room had thickened into something more than just suspicion. It was a quiet terror. The walls seemed to close in around us as each of the gathered faces grew pale and tight with fear. "I will have no more games, no more riddles," Poirot continued, his voice suddenly sharper. "Tomorrow I shall speak the truth, and then we will see who stands in the light and who shrinks away from it." As the others filed out of the room, each carrying their own burden of guilt and confusion, I remained by Poirot's side, watching. His every movement, the weight of his words lingered in the air like a thick fog, and I could not escape the feeling that the revelation we were waiting for would change everything, forever. Poirot stood still for a moment, his gaze fixed on the fireplace. The wax in his fingers was no longer of interest to him, but I could see that his mind was still working, connecting threads that had eluded the rest of us. "Do you know, Hastings?" he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "There is a curious thing about human nature. We will go to great lengths to protect a lie, to shield it from the truth, even if it costs us dearly. But the truth, my friend, always finds its way out, whether we like it or not." I nodded, though the words had a strange resonance. I could feel the pull of something just beyond our reach, a truth hidden behind layers of deception. But as the night drew on, the question remained. What truth? The drawing room was still. The heavy drapes, drawn close, kept the light from the outside world at bay, and only the faintest flicker of candlelight remained. It was as if the house, too, was waiting for the truth to be spoken. Poirot stood at the head of the room, his small figure commanding attention, as always. The others were gathered, their eyes fixed on him, their expressions a mixture of dread, guilt, and perhaps most telling of all, fear. It had been a long few days, full of revelations and half-truths, but now the time had come for Poirot to speak. The silence stretched between us, heavy as the weight of the impending revelation. Poirot finally broke it, his voice calm but filled, with the quiet authority that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. "I have asked you all here tonight, not for the pleasure of your company, but because we are at the end of this story," Poirot said. "The game is finished, and I believe we can now speak the truth." Elsie, Penryn, and Lucien all exchanged uneasy glances, and the tension in the room intensified. I watched Poirot closely, wondering how he would weave the tangled threads of this mystery together. "Let us start, if you will, with the wax," Poirot continued, holding up a small, almost unremarkable piece of charred wax. "When I found it, I was not deceived by its appearance. This was not merely a candle, no, it was a signal of what was to come." The room seemed to hold its breath as Poirot's words began to sink in. He had been hinting at something, but it had not been clear until now. "Clara had arranged to meet someone that night," Poirot said. "She believed she was to confront Lucien Vale, her beloved childhood friend, now turned fiancé. She had discovered something that made her doubt the man she had known for so long." A murmur rippled through the room, and I could see the shifting unease in the others. Lucien's face was a study in perfect composure, but his eyes darted to the side, betraying his nervousness. Poirot's gaze did not waver from him as he continued. "But it was not Lucien who came that night," Poirot said, his voice lowering. "It was someone else entirely. The man Clara had known as Lucien Vale was never him at all." A gasp echoed through the room, and Martin Vale, finally flinched. He swallowed hard, his face paling. "His name," Poirot said, and his voice dropped to a near whisper, "was Martin Vale." There was a stunned silence as the truth of Poirot's words settled over the room. The very air seemed to grow thicker, heavy with the weight of the revelation. Lucien, or rather Martin, stood there, his eyes wide. You don't know what you're saying," he stammered, trying and failing to keep his voice steady. I am Lucien Vale. I've always been Lucien." Poirot's expression remained unchanged, almost serene. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong, monsieur. You are Martin Vale. You assumed the identity of your half-brother after a shipwreck. You became Lucien and no one questioned you until now." A sickly pallor washed over Martin's face. Clara couldn't have known. She couldn't have realized." "She did," Poirot said simply. "Clara was a woman of sharp intelligence. She had begun to suspect, and when she did, she arranged to meet you. It was not Lucien she wanted to speak to. It was you, Martin Vale, The man you truly are." I could see Martin's hands tremble at his sides. He had been caught, cornered in a trap of his own making. I glanced at the others. Penryn's face was twisted with confusion, and Elsie's expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed firmly on Poirot. "But," Penryn began, his voice quivering, "why didn't she say something? Why didn't she expose him sooner?" Poirot gave a small shrug. Perhaps she hoped the truth would come out on its own, or perhaps she feared what would happen if she did. He turned his attention back to Martin, whose face had drained of color. "But the truth, as always, is difficult to hide, n'est-ce pas?" Poirot stepped closer to Martin, his every movement precise, deliberate. "You and Clara struggled that night. She must have confronted you, discovered your deception, and in the heat of the moment you panicked. You killed her." The room froze. Even Martin, for all his bravado, seemed momentarily stunned by the accusation. His eyes darted to the door and then back to Poirot, as though considering running, but the weight of the truth held him in place. "The window," Poirot continued, his voice becoming even softer. "You left through the window. You needed to escape without being seen. The candle you relit. That was not to light the room. It was to create the illusion that Clara had been awake for longer than she truly had been. You staged the scene, making it appear as though she had been up, perhaps even expecting someone else when in reality she had been asleep before your confrontation." Martin took a shaky breath, his composure breaking down completely. "No one would believe me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I just wanted to be someone. I just wanted to be Lucian." Poirot paused, his gaze sharpening. "And that was the fatal mistake, monsieur, to believe that wearing another man's name would make you that man. But the truth always comes to light." The room remained silent, every eye on Martin as he sagged against the back of his chair, defeated. The weight of Poirot's words, the unraveling of his carefully constructed life, had crushed him. Poirot turned to the others, his face still composed. "You see, my friends, the contradictions were there all along. The shoes that did not match, the prints by the window, the letter Clara had written but never sent, the book she had left open. Each one spoke the truth, and each one led me to this moment. And now," Poirot said, his voice firm, "the truth has been revealed. Martin Vale, you are under arrest for the murder of Clara Vale." As the finality of Poirot's words echoed through the room, Martin slumped further into his chair, a defeated man. The mystery was solved. The killer had been named. But even as I watched the scene unfold, I couldn't help but feel the weight of Poirot's final remark linger in my mind. The truth, my friend, always finds its way out, no matter how deeply it is buried. The sun was setting as the final chapter in the tale of Clara Vale's tragic death came to a close. Martin Vale, his face drawn and pale, was escorted from Ashcombe Hall in silence, a shadow of the man who had so expertly woven a life of deceit. The truth, of course, was out, but I had the distinct feeling that, for all its clarity, there would be no peace for those left behind. As the constables led Martin to the waiting carriage, I watched from the drawing-room window, the weight of Poirot's deductions still hanging heavy in the air. The others had all retreated into their own spaces, the shock of the day still settling over them like a dense fog. But Poirot was already moving, his mind already turning to other things. I had been about to take a seat by the fire when I saw Poirot heading toward the staircase. He moved with his usual quiet purpose, his hands tucked neatly behind his back, his small but straight posture betraying nothing of the exhaustion I expected him to feel after such an emotional unraveling of the mystery. "Mon ami, are you not weary?" I asked, following him up the stairs. Poirot stopped at the top of the landing and glanced back at me, his sharp eyes catching mine with an intensity I knew well. "Ah, Hastings, you must know that my work is never done until it is finished. Day, a mystery. It is a small thing in the face of the mind that seeks to solve it." He paused for a moment, and I could see his thoughts shift. "But I admit, my mind is restless today." I nodded, fully understanding. It had been a harrowing experience for all involved, especially Iris, whose heartbreak was still fresh. Poirot's thoughts, however, appeared to be elsewhere. "I am going to speak with Iris," he said, as though reading my mind. "There is much for her to bear, and I fear she is not as strong as she might appear." I watched him move down the hall, his steps soft but decisive. He knocked gently on Iris's door before entering. I lingered outside for a moment, uncertain whether to intrude on what would surely be an intimate conversation, but I trusted Poirot's instincts. He would know what to say. Inside, the room was dim, the curtains drawn against the fading light. Iris sat by the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, shrunken, fragile in her grief. Poirot's voice, when it came, was soft, a balm in the midst of her suffering. "Miss Vale," he said, his voice the epitome of gentleness, "you are to understand that none of this was your fault. Martin's actions, his deceit, none of it was of your making." I stepped closer, quietly leaning against the doorframe. Iris looked up, her eyes swollen from tears, but there was something in the way she gazed at Poirot. A flicker of relief, mingled with her sorrow. "But I should have known," Iris whispered, her voice cracking. "He was never the same after that night on the ship. I thought I could help him, that I could make things right, but I didn't see." Poirot sat down beside her, his hand resting briefly on hers. "You are a woman of great strength, Miss Vale, but you must not blame yourself. For what happened, there was no stopping it. Martin chose his path. You, however, are free to choose yours. That, my dear, is all any of us can do." I remained still, listening to their quiet exchange. Iris's soft sobs filled the space between us, and Poirot, as always, remained calm. His gaze never faltered as he spoke, his words a steady stream of compassion. It was a moment of quiet resolution, a small act of kindness in the face of the past's unrelenting cruelty. After a few minutes, Poirot stood and gave Iris a reassuring smile. "I will leave you now," he said, his tone tender yet firm. "I trust you will find peace in your own time." Iris nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Truly." As Poirot closed the door gently behind him, I saw him pause for a moment at the end of the corridor. He looked down at his shoes as if deep in thought, his brow furrowing just slightly. Then, as though deciding something, he turned toward me. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. "It is time we leave." Ashcombe Hall. I followed him down the stairs, the grand house now strangely quiet. The grand hallway stretched out before us like a memory slowly fading. The great clock on the mantelpiece chimed softly, each tick punctuating the silence. As we made our way toward the front door, Poirot stopped for a moment and turned toward the drawing-room fireplace. The candle, still untouched, stood on the mantel, the small flame flickering faintly in the dim room. Its light seemed so fragile, as though it too had suffered from the weight of everything that had occurred. Poirot, his hands folded neatly, stared at the candle for a long moment. His eyes narrowed as though searching for something hidden within the flickering light, some truth still just out of reach. "The truth, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice almost a whisper, "is like a flame. It may be obscured by smoke, but it will never be extinguished." I couldn't help but glance at the candle as Poirot stepped back, straightening his tie with an almost imperceptible motion. The words seemed to echo in the room, perhaps the most profound of any he had uttered in all. Our time together. We left Ashcombe Hall, the grand doors closing quietly behind us, the echoes of its secrets lingering in the air. As we made our way down the winding road, the evening light fading in the distance, I couldn't help but wonder how many more secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of the world, waiting for a flame to expose them. And Poirot, always calm, always focused, would always be there, pulling at the strands of the tangled web, revealing the truth one delicate thread at a time.